Who are these people?
Wait, I gotta have my mic on. Jeez, I do this every week, Colin. I just press 2 buttons, and things should work. You know, this is how you know we're really
again?
independent. No, this is welcome to independent media, people. Cardboard and bubblegum is what we got here. So you know, they can deal. But anyway, we have a lovely special guest. Anyway, you know, she's if I don't think she needs an introduction, but if I actually went through her whole resume, it would take us a minute. But extensive work on Syria, extensive work on Palestine. I mean, you pick an issue, she's been on it. You know, you can find her at Substack at, I think it's beeley.substack.com, if I'm not mistaken. No?
Yeah, that's right.
Coming to a Substack newsletter near you.
But without further ado, Vanessa Beeley. Hi, Vanessa.
Hi, guys. Lovely to be on with you.
Welcome from Damascus, I do believe. Hopefully your power and internet holds and it doesn't get bombed suddenly. That would be nice. But anyway, this is my co-host, Colin. Colin, who's with me as always. Say hi.
Nice to meet you, Vanessa.
So should we get straight into questions, Colin?
Yeah.
Okay. Well, let's find those here. There. So, Vanessa, for those who don't know you, you've done extensive work on what is happening in Syria. We recently read an article on CIA and MI6 involvement in infiltration in Palestine and Syria using coffee shops, WhatsApp groups, and other online orgs to cut out like IncoStrat. Can you speak on your experiences dealing with and documenting that?
You mean the organization IncoStrat is involved in the spying in Palestine?
One of many, right?
Surprising.
Yeah.
Yeah, one of many. I mean, actually, it's a little bit weird because IncoStrat is pretty much now a bit of a shell company. It was established by Emma Lemessurier and Paul Tilley, from memory. I'm digging back in my hard drive now. Tilley was former British military intelligence, as was James Lemessurier, who established, of course, the famous CIA MI6 white helmets embedded with Al-Qaeda in Syria from 2013 onwards, producing the chemical weapon propaganda to vilify the Syrian government and to basically enable and sustain foreign intervention during the regime change war. And IncoStrat was established basically to run PR for the armed groups, the illegal armed groups inside Syria, which of course included one of the named groups that they were supposed to be providing this PR for was Jaish al-Islam, based predominantly in eastern Ghouta in Damascus, the eastern suburbs of Damascus, and who conducted some of the worst atrocities against Syrian civilians, particularly, of course, against non-compliant extremist Islamist ideologues. And that included the caging of Shia civilians, the massacre in 2013 in the industrial city of Adra to the north of Damascus. And so basically, IncoStrat was responsible for presenting Jaish al-Islam as one of these freedom-loving, democratic, promoting groups inside Syria trying to topple the bad dictator Bashar al-Assad.
Right.
And then Emma Lemessurier basically then, I think it was in 2018, she became part of the management team at Mayday Rescue, which was a spin-off basically from the White Helmets to funnel the European, the US, and the UK funds to the White Helmets. In other words, to give the government in the UK plausible deniability, because at that point, the image of the White Helmets was getting a little bit kind of tarnished, let's say, after they participated in a number of summary executions and beheadings and crimes again against Syrian civilians. And from there, basically, she again ran the regime change war PR, but from within made a rescue. So Inkostrat has a history of these kind of operations, but where it's interesting for me is Inkostrat is effectively a bit of a shell company now, as I said, because the majority of the employees went on to a company called INN2, so In2, which
Gotcha.
is run by Paul Tilley, but is also staffed by many of the former employees of Inkostrat. And Inkostrat, the last time I looked, I think it's got less than 6 employees, but it's still and it's based in the US. It hasn't, to my knowledge, filed, a FARA, foreign agent
relations
form.
Yeah.
In the US, because I checked that about a year ago. And it's still receiving significant funding from the UK regime. And the really interesting thing is when I started to dig into this, because the UK government, for people to know, it produces every month a kind of spreadsheet of everyone it funds over £25,000. Now, funnily enough, when I started to really dig into Inkostrat, guess what? They stopped publishing this spreadsheet. And when we chased them up for an answer as to why this, publicly available spreadsheet suddenly was no longer publicly available, we were told that they were working on the formatting and that effectively it's not going to be available ever again because we're not going to give you the information to basically shoot ourselves in the foot.
Right.
That's what it came down.
Similar stuff in Iran too, right? Color Revolution, very similar companies working in there.
Oh yeah, absolutely. I mean, it's an entire complex. I mean, we've just seen it in Venezuela. And the interesting thing, though, in Israel, I mean, I would say the British intelligence operations are probably way more active in Lebanon, especially right now with the threat of escalation between the Zionist entity and Hezbollah and the various resistance factions in the south of Lebanon. But we know, for example, that many of the same elements that were involved in the destabilization efforts in Syria have been involved for a long time in infiltrating Lebanese military, intelligence, security, government sectors in preparation, potentially, for this kind of escalation. We know that NATO troops are now embedded in Tripoli in the north of Lebanon, ostensibly to enable the evacuation of citizens. But I mean, we've heard these kind of stories quite a few times previously. Yeah. But in Israel itself, I mean, you've got the IOF, the Israeli, I always want to say offense forces, but the occupation forces, who have their own spy unit, the 8200 unit, from which has been spawned multiple surveillance and AI and cyber tech companies that are now kind of tentacling out into UK cyber surveillance and so on, right. Health sectors, education sectors, and the same in the US. I mean, Oracle, for example, which is one of the biggest storage platforms, is a Zionist backed organization established by Unit 8200 former operatives, 100% supportive of Israel. It doesn't employ anyone that doesn't support Israel and gets rid of anyone that doesn't. And that's an organization which is effectively mining your personal data.
Yep, one of many now.
Certainly in the UK, but I think also in the US.
Yeah, connected to Twitter, plus just the general AI military industrial wing that's now trying things out. Palestine, lavender stuff, that kind of thing. But leads me to my next question. What is it like having to deal with Western foreign policy? You know, can you share your day-to-days? You know, people living in Damascus under threat of Israel retaliation constantly. You know.
Actually, I mean, that's quite a difficult question to answer in a condensed way.
Yeah.
One of the reasons, if I speak personally, one of the reasons I live here is I don't have to explain myself 24/7.
Right.
You know, when I was living in Europe, nobody really got what I was talking about. Nobody really understood the issues in Palestine, or a very small minority did. And I was endlessly getting banned from dinner invitations and so on, because at that time, the Syria propaganda was rampant. Assad was, you know, the big bogeyman for everyone in the West. And so it became very difficult for me to be arguing the reality with people that were completely brainwashed by Western media and government institutions and UN agencies and so on, you know, to the point of complete ignorance over what was happening here. So from that perspective, I'm a lot happier here because, as I said, I'm in the heart of the resistance. I mean, Syria is the land bridge between Iran, Iraq, and the Palestinian and Lebanese resistance. Syria, one of the reasons that this war was waged against Syria was because of its steadfast solidarity with Palestinians and with the Palestinian cause and with the resistance factions. But living under Western barbarism and economic savagery is very difficult. I mean, in the Northeast, you have the US occupying Syrian resources, which includes all of its oil resources, and trading those oil resources outside the country, so depriving the Syrian people of energy and fuel, which impacts on all aspects of their lives, from the health sector to the education sector, to transport, to heating in the winter, to air conditioning in the summer, to fridges working or not working, to not being able to pump water to the water tanks, etc. So it has a very debilitating effect on civilian life here. And then the fact that Syria is effectively under blockade. I mean, it's occupied on 2/3 of its borders by hostile entities, including Turkey, including US proxies, US direct military occupation, Israel in the south, and the only exit really is to Lebanon and Jordan, but Jordan has played a real double game, you know, throughout, and is definitely not a friend of the resistance axis. And of course now you've got an actual NATO base being established in Jordan, which pretty much says everything that you need to know about Jordan. And so, you know, life here is tough. 90% of people are living below whatever poverty line you want to apply to that whole paradigm. There's very little future for them. There's a lot of difficulty for people to actually leave Syria. There's a lot of embargoes now on travel for Syrians because of the so-called refugee crisis, which of course is a direct result of US cartel neocolonialism, but of course that's forgotten in the whole refugee crisis narrative. So it's tough. I'm not going to say it isn't tough. I have a relatively privileged position because I'm paid outside, so I'm bringing dollars into the country. It's a lot easier for me. I'm not going to say it's incredibly difficult for me, but at the same time, you know, you are living, I mean, where the area where I'm living, we've had 3 houses destroyed pretty close to me by Israeli assassination attempts. There have been at least 3 or 4 Israeli assassinations on the road 5 minutes away from me. And, you know, Damascus, as you said, is regularly targeted as is Homs, Masyaf, Latakia, Aleppo. More recently has twice been targeted, and Israel has actually violated Syrian airspace to do so using Jordanian airspace and the Al Tanaf US military base as air cover to enter from the east. So, you know, at the moment, to a degree, what Syria, I think, is trying to do is to clear the military decks in preparation for any kind of escalation with Israel. So you've got the Syrian Arab Army right now trying to clean the central desert area of the ISIS terrorist cells that are being armed and equipped by the US as another of their proxies, and have been attacking both civilians and military bases and vehicles, etc. You've got ongoing negotiations to normalize relations with Turkey, which, you know, are very dependent on whether Erdogan is prepared to basically withdraw from all Syrian territory that he's currently occupying, and to withdraw his terrorist proxies and his military forces that are on the ground inside Syria, illegally, of course. And so the necessity is to basically for Syria to take control of the area north of the M4, which is the arterial road from Aleppo in the north to Latakia on the coast, which currently is a sort of no man's land, supposedly patrolled by Russia and Turkey, although that has only just started up again. So, you know, Syria is in a position where I think it's really trying to clean everything up in preparation for any kind of expansion of the war, because if there is escalation into Lebanon, then Syria will automatically be pulled into that. But what it has been doing is opening up its territory, of course, for example, for the Iraqi resistance forces and various other kind of unnamed resistance factions that have been attacking Israel from Syrian territory. And that's another reason that Syria is constantly being targeted by Israel, because Israel is perfectly well aware that the role that Syria is playing, despite having its hands full militarily, economically, politically, it is still opening up its territory and making itself vulnerable in order to provide assistance for Gaza and the Palestinians.
Right. Well, it leads me into a bit of a follow-up. What, in your opinion, is the one thing you wish people could experience traveling to Syria? What have you learned or experienced since being on the ground and speaking with people in the region that miss watching from afar? I'm sure a whole list of things.
Yeah, again, that's a very detailed question and answer. I think for me, the main thing, because this is what I come up against all the time, and actually I came up against it fairly recently regarding Palestine, where somebody actually said in a kind of chat box in another interview, they said, well, the reason they supported Israel was because they don't want a Muslim state in place of the Zionist entity. And I just like, you know, I don't know what people think Syria is or what Palestine was. I mean, Palestine was it was part of Syria, actually, originally, of course, as was Lebanon. But Palestine was secular. It wasn't a Muslim state. It was a Muslim majority, but it was inclusive of Middle Eastern, Mizrahi or Sephardic Jews. It was inclusive of Middle Eastern Christians. It was inclusive of Middle Eastern atheists and so on, communists, socialists. I mean, the list goes on, and that's reflected in the resistance factions, by the way. They're also not all Islamic. Right, and so what I would say to people about Syria, because it is, I think it's probably a kind of a universal misrepresentation of the Middle East, but particularly Syria. Syria is such a diverse country. You know, I mean, I was trying to explain to someone the other day, if you go to the Old City on a Thursday night, which is kind of the start of our weekend here, Thursday and Friday are the weekends. If you enter the old city, it's like being in, I don't know, one of the really buzzy areas of New York, right? You've got nightclubs and music and street life and people, women wearing hijabs with friends that are wearing miniskirts and low-cut blouses, and Christians and Muslims, you know, out celebrating together. And I mean, it's crazy. It goes on until 6 a.m. I mean, if you go out on a Thursday night, don't expect to get any sleep. There's techno bars, there's, you know, there's everything you can possibly imagine in one area. But if you walk 5 minutes into another area, you come into the Shia Islam area, which is, you think it's another whole world because it's dead quiet. So you've come from the Christian area, really, but I mean, it's mixed, into the Shia area, which is beautifully calm and peaceful. And then if you cross the street and go into another few alleyways, you enter what used to be the Jewish area, which, funnily enough, most of the houses were rented by Palestinians after the 1948 Nakba. And Straight Street, which is the street, the main kind of street in the old city that takes you to the Hamdaniya souk. But this was the street where Saul had his epiphany and converted to Christianity. So, you know, you've, in the Umayyad Mosque in the old city, you've got the remains of John the Baptist. This is what Syria is. You can be in the old city and you can hear the azan, the call to prayer, and 2 seconds later, mixing with it, you've got the church bells. And again, even from a Christian point of view, you've got Presbyterians, you've got Catholic, you've got Orthodox, which of course is the big connection also with Russia. And then if you extend out from Damascus, you have Ismaili, you have Yazidi, you have Druze, you have Shia, Alawite, and again, Christians, even external to Damascus itself, in all the areas of Syria. So it doesn't matter where you go. Nobody actually asks you, are you Christian, are you Muslim? First and foremost, Syrians are Syrian. Their faith is secondary to their being Syrian. But I think, you know, this is what shocks people the most, and this is what I constantly try to explain to people, that you have no idea of the diversity of the culture, the heritage, the history, and the people here in Syria, the hospitality that you will receive wherever you go here. Sorry, one of the dogs is set off. And from that perspective, it's one of the safest places I've ever been in also.
Right.
Like, I can go out of my house at 1 a.m., 2 a.m. and just walk the streets. No one will bother me. Absolutely no one. And that applies to pretty much anywhere in Syria, except of course the still occupied areas by the Al-Qaeda factions, which is the northwest, really.
Right. Well, leads us to our next question, which of course it does. What would you tell people? Because a lot of people I'm sure you talk to will immediately reply back to you, well, you live under a dictatorship. So is there any validity to any of that claims of torturing prisoners and chemical weapon attacks? I already know most of your answer, but feel free to tell our audience who might not know, you know?
I guess my answer would be, dude, look in the mirror. I think if anyone's living in a totalitarian environment right now, it's the US and the UK and the EU. I mean, come on, seriously? You know, I mean, it's like saying Iran doesn't have women's rights. I mean, like, you know, that's the most, it's just insane. Have you seen President Assad walking out in the middle of some of the most crowded areas of Damascus with absolutely no security? Can any of your presidents or any of the European leaders or any of the UK leaders do that? without getting eggs in their face. I mean, come on.
I wish that happened more
seriously,
often. Would be nice.
Well, I think Macron gets it every time he goes out. Look, when people talk about a dictatorship, you assume that nobody will talk about politics, nobody will criticize the government. Come to Syria, get in the taxi. The first taxi you get into, if they speak a little bit of English, the first thing they will start telling you is the government this, the government did that, the government cut the electricity, the blah, blah, blah. And they will moan for the whole journey. A lot of it is justified, by the way. If you go into any bar, into any restaurant, people are talking politics everywhere, literally everywhere.
Yes.
You know? What I will say is generally for people, they're happy to criticize the government, but kind of the president is the red line. And not because out of fear of retribution, but because the respect for their president, who basically never left the country throughout the 13 years regime change war, even when ISIS were 20 kilometers away from, or even less actually, from where he lives in Damascus, which by the way is not some kind of ornate palace. It's a relatively simple residential apartment. And he's famous actually for getting in his car late at night when he can't sleep on his own without any security detail and just driving around Damascus. And he loves apparently surprising the checkpoints, because when they see the car, they obviously stop it. We still have some security checkpoints. Most of them have now been dismantled in Damascus. And then they realize that it's the president on his own in his own car driving around Damascus. You know, these aren't just kind of little anecdotes. These happen on a regular basis. Yeah, of course, you know, there are issues in Syria, most of which have been generated by the war and by the economic sanctions and the blockade and the siege and the theft of resources and so on. And yes, the government is struggling to, you know, to maintain services. But at the same time, and this is something, you know, particularly in the US, where I know everyone struggles with healthcare and health insurance and so on, but I will give you an anecdote. I had kidney problems fairly recently, and I was like, okay, what do I do? Because I'm in UK mode where, you know, you have to wait 3 weeks to get an appointment and so on. So I spoke to my friend and he said, no, don't worry, I'll call the kidney specialist at one of the hospitals. So he called the kidney specialist, like one of the top kidney surgeons in Syria. He called him at 10 in the morning. At 2 in the afternoon, I saw him for a consultation. Within 24 hours, I had the treatment that I needed to kind of, you know, bash the stone to pieces. And he refused to take any money for it because I'm a guest in his country.
Wow.
So, you know, another thing that I guess, you know, as part of the other question you asked, is that what I love about living here is that they still have those traditional values, the values of hospitality and generosity and trust and community. Like, families are still really important. You know, elderly parents don't get put in nursing homes. They're kept in the family and taken care of by the family and the grandkids and so on. And that sense of community, which certainly in the UK, in my opinion, has been destroyed, deliberately destroyed by successive governments and you know, corporate oligarchs and so on through various projects, including, of course, the COVID project most recently. Whereas here, that very traditional lifestyle still exists. And yes, you know, it's based in a religion, but it's not an institutional religion. It's a faith that these people grow up in, that governs their behavior and governs their reactions to their neighbors, to their friends, to their family, to their guests. it's part of the DNA. It's not an institutionalized control mechanism. It's something that is deeply embedded within them. It's a spirituality, regardless of what label you put on that on that element within them. And again, that's something that has been systematically eroded and destroyed in the West, in my opinion.
Yeah, I've said this, I'm not sure if I said this on the stream before, but I've visited Jordan over a decade ago, and I can vouch for you in terms of, if you go to the Middle East, I think especially with people knowing that you're coming a long way, the hospitality that I experienced in Jordan and Morocco were probably some of the most, I think, surprising to me, because that's not necessarily talking about, but it was probably the top as far as the most welcoming that I've ever received in any country that I visited. And yeah, I'm glad that you kind of said that, just given you being in Syria, it kind of vouches that region that they really respect the idea of visitors coming in, because they understand it takes a lot, you know, to come in, and especially in those countries. So the idea that you're coming for them, they really take honor in that, and they will do anything for you to essentially welcome you in their communities in that way. So I'm really happy that you kind of mentioned that, just kind of going off of my experience. But kind of want to go into a little bit about you and your family a little bit. You've mentioned on Twitter that you that your father was anti-Zionist. Can you share how his stance on the ideology influenced you?
Yeah, I think it had an influence probably after he passed away in 2001, because growing up, it was just something, you know, it was kind of normal for me, being with my dad at various events and so on. And I guess I probably absorbed it by some kind of symbiosis, but I wasn't very focused on it. I had my own path, and my dad was not, he was kind of a bit of the Victorian era, you know, he didn't have, we didn't have a very close relationship. But after he died in 2001, I inherited all of his confidential papers. And I guess at some point I started to go through them, and I started to really find out, sadly, after he died, who my dad really was, and, you know, the incredible impact that he had, both on the Middle East, but also on, at that time, British politics, where there was a major pushback against the Jewish settlement in Palestine, because, as he predicted, it would lead to decades of bloodshed, which of course it has. He was vehemently against the Zionist movement, and equally he was hated by the Zionist movement, because they understood that he was someone, you know, not to be messed with, really, as some of the descriptions of him talk about. So I guess, you know, growing up, because as a kid I was with him in, I'm showing my age now, in Cairo in '67. And then of course, you know, he was always lecturing about Palestine, even after he retired. So yes, you know, and our dinner conversations were always politically minded anyway. So I guess, yes, it affected me hugely. Certainly the connection to the Middle East was always there. Even as a kid, I was told I quite often used to escape and disappear off to the local mosque, and I was found there by the security because I wasn't really supposed to go off on my own, this kind of thing. So yeah, it definitely created a connection to the Middle East, and I reconnected in 2012 when I came back to Egypt and went back to the embassy, which was kind of weird because it hadn't changed at all. And went to see where they had basically put a memorial stone for my dad. And then I went from there on into Gaza. But I think, in a way, he's affected me more now than when he was alive. You know, I think subliminally, I'm always kind of checking in with him when I'm researching something or I'm analyzing something. And it's kind of nice when I talk to people that are heavily invested into research and analysis and who actually knew people who knew him and so on. So I think I'm, in a way, on a personal level, I'm also reconnecting with him through my work.
No, I mean, it absolutely. I mean, we also have some connections to you. Our first coverage of Palestine was one of your articles. I think that's a pretty good start, if I had to say so myself. But where you talked about, you reported on the cast-iron bread operation, which no one knows about, other than a few people. But it's where Israelis were forced to admit that they contaminated the Palestinian water supply with typhoid. A blatant war crime. Can you elaborate on this briefly and other atrocities that have gone underreported prior to October 7th?
Well, I mean, there were multiple. I mean, people describe Yitzhak Rabin as the peacemaker, but he's the guy who, yeah, exactly. You know, he's the guy who brought in the breaking their bones policy, where the IOF literally used to, I mean, there are videos circulating of it, and it's absolutely horrific, where they would literally just break the bones of kids and civilians that they picked up for throwing stones or whatever, or that, you know, they didn't need a pretext to do so. And Israel has committed endless crimes. I mean, that's why we all say, you know, it didn't begin on October the 7th. It actually began way before even 1917. 1917 was the watershed, the Balfour Treaty. And Balfour, by the way, was a die-in-the-world Zionist himself, Christian Zionist. As was Churchill, actually, Winston Churchill.
Right.
You know, and so, but you know, even if you fast forward to today, you see the same things. I mean, you're hearing now about a polio outbreak. Well, if you actually read someone like William Engdahl, who had polio when he was 5 years old and was paralyzed as a result, he's done a huge amount of research into it. And his claim is basically that it's not a virus. Polio comes from the introduction of a toxin into the body, into the brain. And at that time, of course, when he contracted polio was when the use of DDT was sanctioned, and it was basically being sprayed everywhere. And there is, according to him, a correlation between the then prohibition of DDT and the drop in polio cases. And so now what we're suddenly seeing in Gaza, which immediately set off my alarm bells, quite rightly after what you said, the poisoning of the water with typhoid previously, and that's, I'm quite sure it's been done multiple times, particularly in Gaza, because Gaza is a 40-kilometer by 12-kilometer extermination camp, and Israel totally controls all the water, for example, and all the food that comes into that camp. So how easy is it to introduce disease into that camp if you want to, for want of a better word, cull the population, right? I mean, there are diseases in Gaza that, considering the relatively healthy lifestyle they have when they're not being bombed by Israel, is unusual. And there's been a huge spike, as far as I know, in cancer cases and so on and so forth. But suddenly there's an outbreak of polio. And actually, I was talking to William about this, William Engdahl, on Saturday. And what he said to me, well, you know, the polio could have been introduced, but it could also be present in the conditions that are there anyway, because, you know, there's raw sewage in the streets and in the makeshift camps. All the water supply has been destroyed, the water tanks. There was a video only a few days ago with the Zionists blowing up, the big water siphons, no, what do you call them? The huge bulk water carrier things, and blowing them up. So it could be that whatever is causing the polio has been introduced by the appalling sanitation conditions anyway. It could be that it has been introduced as a toxin, but then of course, what's going to happen next? The rollout of the vaccine, and what faction of society does polio affect? Children under the age of 5.
Right.
So I mean, it doesn't take a huge amount to figure out what's happening here. And then you have, I mean, again, very recently, the protests at the prison that was carrying out rectal rape against Palestinian prisoners, but not protests against the rape, protests against the possible prosecution of the soldiers that committed the rape.
Which is exactly how they did human shields not that long ago. They had a whole, no, we got to keep doing these despicable things. How dare you take that privilege away from us? It's
but you know who started the whole human shield thing? Were the British.
Right. Yeah.
The British back in the Arab uprisings against the Zionist occupation, which was beginning post 1917. And the British decided that the only way they could push back against the Arab-Palestinian uprising was to take human shields. Right. And that was the only way they could drive safely into the resistance areas in Palestine. So it was the British that started the whole, human shield atrocity. And then of course it's all blamed on Hamas.
Right.
But it's the Israelis. There's no evidence of Hamas taking human shields. And it's laughable when they actually say that Hamas, I mean, again, I've been in Gaza in 2012, 2013. Eva Bartlett, a dear friend and another fantastic journalist, has been in Palestine extensively from 2007 onwards, but in Gaza at the same time as me, and then prior to that in 2008 and 9 as well. But when you talk about human shields, as I said, Gaza is 40 kilometers by 12 kilometers. It's tiny. So of course it's an incredibly built up area with 1.2, 1.4 million civilians living there. But let's have a look at Tel Aviv or occupied Jaffa, right?
Yeah.
The, what's it called? The Har Kiria military base is in the center of Tel Aviv, right in the middle of residential areas and schools and hospitals and so on. So what's the difference? The only difference is it's not being targeted, because the resistance effectively is generally not targeting civilians, it's targeting military installations. What is Israel doing? Almost exclusively targeting civilians.
Incredible. Collin, you went on Press TV recently, right? And I think you had some stuff from that.
Yeah, so I spoke, so by the time we upload this episode, I don't think the interview will be out yet, but I briefly spoke about China's mediation in the Beijing Declaration that was signed last week by various Palestinian factions. And since that interview, I thought more about this joint venture in regards to BRICS. In your opinion, is the liberation of Palestine possible when China, Russia, and even Iran have seemingly backed proposals for Hamas and others to unite with Fatah and the PLO?
I kind of have mixed feelings about this China venture with the resistance factions, because if you look at what historically has happened with Palestine, and I'm just reading the 100 Years War on Palestine, which I recommend to everyone to read, because historically it's just fascinating. Palestine has kind of been used as a political football by almost every country involved in the cause from the beginning. And, you know, we kind of shouldn't forget really that it was the US and the Soviet Union that voted for the partitioning of Palestine back in 47 when it was partitioned by the UN. Britain actually abstained because Britain at that point had realized that actually the Zionist project wasn't such a great idea because, you know, it was actually going to kind of take control of British Middle East interests away from the British and put it in the lap of the United States and potentially even then the Soviet Union. To some degree, and I haven't really kind of gone into this in any depth, and I haven't really talked about it prior to now, it's just a nagging doubt in my mind as to why this was done. And potentially, and also I tend not to look at these things with kind of rose-tinted glasses like a lot of people do, because I think you have to forget about that, because even China and Russia have their own national interests as
in
a
India.
priority, right?
Right.
Yeah. Oh God, no! Don't get me on India.
Yeah.
Don't get me on India.
Brazil, both of them. Like,
yeah, no, you know, and I think that's where we have to be really careful as journalists not to get kind of swept away by, oh my God, there's a resolution and there's a, you know, I mean, effectively, look, China brokered, effectively, I suppose, the peace between Iran and Saudi Arabia, but there's still issues. You know, yeah, I mean, it's kind of, it's a lot of politics and maneuvering. And I think what was very telling for me was after the statement had been put out about the reconciliation, and of course China was taking credit for having brought them all together. Right. I think it was in Al Mayadeen, they published the fact that a number of the resistance factions had actually said it's not accurate because we insisted for the PLO, for example, that they should cease to recognize the state of Israel. So I actually published quite recently a kind of a bit of a manifesto from what I would consider the real groundswell of Palestinian resistance, who are very critical, actually, historically, of the role of the PLO and of Fatah, and even of Hamas to some degree, and the degree to which they've kind of sold out Palestinian nationalism. So from my perspective, and again, you know, it's a controversial subject, but let's take Hamas, for example. Hamas are effectively Muslim Brotherhood, and Hamas were involved in the destabilization project in Syria. They were expelled from Syria as a result. Damascus had given refuge to Khalid Mashal and Ismail Haniyeh, the leaders, the political wing leaders in Hamas, until they realized that actually Hamas was betraying them. Now, since 2017, Said Nasrallah, the Secretary General of Hezbollah, has been brokering normalization between Hamas and the original resistance axis, which is Iran and Syria and elements within Iraq and Hezbollah, because Hamas had pivoted towards you know, the heavy funders in Qatar and Saudi Arabia, and of course the two countries were responsible for funding the regime change war in Syria, Qatar particularly. And so Fatah, we know, is just a wingman for the Zionist entity, right? I mean, Fatah is a joke for most Palestinians. When I'm also speaking about the betrayal of Hamas, I'm not necessarily talking about the military wing, by the way, because the armed resistance and the multiple, there's more than 17 armed resistance factions in Gaza. It's only because Hamas has been given, in a sense, the leading role by the resistance axis also, who have promoted Hamas as the kind of head of all these resistance factions.
Right.
But it depends really who from Hamas was involved, who from Fatah was involved in this reconciliation process. But personally, I remain a little bit skeptical, and I that's just my personal perspective, but I would like to talk to my friends, you know, like Marwa Osman and so on, and I haven't yet had an opportunity to do so, but I am skeptical.
Well, what do you think are the next? What do you think should happen next for Palestinian liberation? Right? What would that even look like? First of all, like, and is there any tangible actions that our audience can take to assist? You know,
I think really the most important thing is this fight against Zionism, against the Zionist movement.
Mm-hmm.
Because the thing is that the Zionist movement is not only occupying Palestine, it's occupying the US, and it's occupying the UK, and it's occupying the EU. So in a sense, people in the US have their own war against the Zionist occupation of, you know, pretty much all of their essential sectors and infrastructure, right? Whether it's the military industrial complex, whether it's the media, whether it's your political system. And this is why I've just been, you know, tearing my hair out after the kind of so-called Trump assassination, and how people are still falling for this duopoly, for this political system, which is completely kind of, you know, it's totally occupied. It doesn't matter who becomes president.
Right.
It doesn't matter who they pick for their administration. It doesn't matter, because they're all controlled.
right?
Right? And they're all controlled by the Zionist movement. I mean, why do your congressman have to sign a pledge of allegiance to Israel? Is Israel the US?
Right.
You know, I'm sorry, but who do your leaders represent? Are they really representing the US, or are they representing the interests of Israel?
Right.
Yeah, we know the answer.
Kennedy was really clear about this. Surprisingly, because he's an absolute, again,
Right.
sort of
Wanted them to
cut it
sign.
through the middle, and he's got Zionist written all the way through.
Wanted to force them to have foreign agent relations signed with them, right? What happened to him?
Yeah,
Something happened to him. You know, I vaguely remember something in Houston, but you know, what do I remember?
I'm talking Robert F. Kennedy. I'm talking
Sure.
Robert, I mean, young Kennedy. But
Yeah.
you know, I mean, he was perfectly clear about what Israel represents. It represents the bloc for the rise of the global south, or rather the freedom and independence of the global south, and
Yeah.
the rise of any threat to US and Zionist control of the region and the world resources.
Mhm.
Right?
Yeah.
And this has been clear for decades. I mean, this shouldn't come as a surprise to people. And anyone who thinks Trump getting in is going to resolve anything, they're absolutely insane and delusional. Because
Well,
if you
not
look
even-
at the 4 years of Trump presidency, and what he did to the Middle East, and what he did to the Palestinian cause, and how he effectively enabled Greater Israel to come into being through the Abraham Accords, you know, I mean, it's insane. So I think, from my perspective, and I say this about the UK as well, you've got to recognize how your state is entirely captured by this movement now. Like, what Britain basically effectively gave birth to, rather like Frankenstein, has now become a bigger Frankenstein than Britain, way more, and actually is in danger of becoming a bigger Frankenstein than the US, right?
Right.
Which is,
I mean, it's
incredible.
not just Trump, though.
Yeah, right.
Like you mentioned,
Yeah,
it's not
Kamala,
just
same,
Trump.
same.
Same thing with
Same
Kamala
thing.
as well. And it's funny. I think
Third
that
parties
people,
aren't any better,
right?
unfortunately.
Well, just the argument that all of our government, as you said, is captured. So across the board. But I do have one last question for you before you go. So other than you, can can you give our audience a few resource recommendations? So other journalists, books, news networks, podcasts, documentaries, so they can have a better understanding of what's happening in the region.
We can't all be in the region. I'd love to. There's plenty of dates I'd like to go try over there. But, you know.
Yeah. Well, you're welcome. I mean, actually, for people to understand as well, it's actually very easy, to come to Syria. I mean, there are now really good little tourist agencies that are running, you know, week-long or 2-week-long tours. It's not expensive. It's really not expensive. I mean, the flight's probably the biggest
Yes, probably the more
expense.
expensive part. Yeah.
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 And you know, come and see this history before potentially it is really kind of destroyed. I hope not. I really hope not. But you know, it is the cradle of civilization, and it is an extraordinary country to visit. You will not regret it, and you will go away from it with such an understanding of what's going on in the world today. That's the thing, because there isn't one person in Syria that doesn't get what's been going on for years here. So resources, Kivok Almasyan, who's Armenian Syrian, based in Europe, but his show is Syriana Analysis, and he does fantastic analysis on the region. Eva Bartlett, of course, who you know, we've both spent time together in Palestine and here in Syria. She's done incredible work in Donbass. She's been to Venezuela and to DPRK. Fiorella Isabel, of course, who has, you know, I think one of the best understandings of US politics. Resources, David Miller in the UK. On the whole Zionist movement. We recently did a really good interview, or I think it was a really good interview with him, where he breaks down how the Zionist movement has infiltrated even organizations like Antifa, the so-called anti-fascist movements in the UK, how they coined the phrase Islamist extremist,
Right.
and they created Islamophobia, actually. So the Zionists, he explains, I mean, he just blew my mind, and I thought I had a pretty good understanding of it, but I mean, he just took it to another level. So he's a really good source. Books, I'm hopeless at actually remembering titles and stuff. Can I send you a list
100-Year
that
Wars?
you can put
Yes,
in
you-
the...
Yes, you
Yes, you
can.
can.
Yeah.
that would be a lot easier, because I'm just terrible at remembering everything.
You already mentioned 100-Year War in Palestine.
Yeah, the 100 Years War on Palestine. But I've forgotten the name of the author. I'm sorry. I'm
That's okay.
terrible these days.
You're good. Me too.
Ilan Pape, of course, is pretty solid, particularly on the history of you know, how the awful non-state of Israel, as I call it, was created. Yeah. Oh God, who else have I recently been reading? Oh, there's a ton of stuff. Can I send you all the titles and the authors?
Yes, you can. I will happy take that. You know. So
no, because there's one really good book. Actually, let me just see, because obviously I can't get English books in Syria, so I had to resort to a kind of Kindle type thing, because it's the only way I can get to read anything. 100 Years War on Palestine is Rashid Khalid, Khalid. But the one that is really good, that gives like a really wide history of the whole region leading up to the war against Syria, is The Struggle of Major Powers Over Syria. No, I can't find the author. Anyway, I'll send that one to you.
perfect. We'll link stuff in the description for people.
Yeah, I can send you a load of stuff.
Struggle of Major Powers Over Syria is written by, hold on, Jamal Wakim.
Yeah.
So
these, you know, these are all regional voices, and of course, because under British occupation of Palestine, and even previously under the Ottoman Empire occupation, but particularly under the British occupation, the Palestinian story was completely silenced. You know, all of the kind of resistance newspapers that were established to try and talk about the Zionist influx were shut down and censored. The editors and so on were arrested and imprisoned. So the Palestinian story wasn't actually allowed to be seen, while of course the Zionist story was, as it is now, promoted and supported and absolutely amplified by the West and by Western media and Western regimes. But the Palestine story was silenced from very early on, even before 1917, which is quite extraordinary. So I think it's really important to read regional voices, because they're the voices of experience, and even historically, they're going to be telling you things that you're not going to be told in school.
Right.
Right.
And you're certainly not going to be told by Washington Post or CNN or BBC or any of those. You know, so it's very important to read their voices, in my opinion. One other person, particularly on Yemen, is Professor Issa Blumi, B-L-U-M-I. And he's written some of the best books on the history of Yemen, for example, who are, you know, the king of the resistance, in my opinion,
yes.
at the moment.
Very fun seeing them take over boats.
Yeah.
But we're, I think, out of time. So feel free to tell people how to follow you, where they should go.
Oh, can I just mention Marwa Osman as well? Please follow Marwa Osman.
You're not allowed. But yeah.
Anyway, Substack mainly, and Twitter, X, whatever it is, Telegram. I'm still on YouTube. I don't know how. But Substack's the main one.
Yeah, perfect. Well, I think that's it. I think we got through all our stuff, which is great.
Pretty much.
Cool.
All right, Vanessa, lovely to have you on. We'll definitely do this again.
Really nice to be on with you guys. Thanks.
Same. As always, kids, labels are bad. Stay independent. Good night, fam.
We want to talk right down to earth in a language that everybody here can easily understand.